research shows that when we feel better, when we feel happier, it makes us more motivated. It makes us more engaged. Like employees who are happier are more engaged. They're better performers. They're better colleagues. They're less likely to burn out. They're less likely to not show up for work, and they're less likely to leave the company.
All right, Cassie, let's do this. So, the more I've gone into your work and the more I've researched some of your content, there's a lot of parallels between your work and what I've been doing. So, my podcast has always been focused on helping young people live like a richer and more fulfilling life. But I use the word richer for a particular reason, is because for some people it's to do with money. For me, it's probably more purpose, fulfillment, and joy, and also freedom, because it's this multi kind of factorial aspect of it. And I feel like with your work and your book, there's going to be a lot of parallels between our work today.
Yeah, exactly. And I would actually, there's something that I have been saying because I focus on the role of time in particular and how that relates to life satisfaction. And what I say is that the answer for greater happiness and satisfaction isn't about being time rich, it's about making the time you have rich. So even using that term richness, what I am absolutely talking about is how do we make the hours of our days feel fulfilling and satisfying and purposeful and joyful.
Mhm.
And that sort of translates into greater satisfaction and fulfillment with life more generally. So we're in the same camp about richness in
Mhm.
terms of quality more than quantity.
Of course. And there's one particular part of from your research as well where you discuss like the time you spent, like in terms of how much spare time you have. Can you
Yeah.
give some examples on that? So you're saying that people less than 2 hours of spare time are generally more unhappy, and people that have more than 5 hours are generally more unhappy. That's interesting because you
Yeah.
could consider some people like the investment bankers who are going back to back to meetings, and you could also consider people who don't work and they could be at home all day and then they're feeling quite anxious and depressed. What did you see from your kind of studies in that area?
Yeah, and it was really born out of the motivator of why I do my work and very personal experience where I felt like my biggest challenge for happiness was time. And in particular, the limitations of like the number of hours in the day. And I felt extremely time poor. And this is something that we've gone on to research. So that's that sort of acute feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it. And in a very sort of time poor state, considered leaving my job. I was like, I don't know if I can do it between having a baby and a husband, and so I wanted to be a good parent, a good partner. I had the pressures at work as a assistant professor at Wharton at the time, and then like the never-ending pile of chores. It was just like there was so much to do and not enough hours in the day to do it all, let alone to do any of it well, let alone to enjoy any of it along the way. And I sort of had this breaking point where I was like, I don't think I can do it. I need more time. And I sort of daydreamed like, if I quit and moved to a sunny island somewhere and had, all the hours of my days to spend exactly how I wanted, then I would be happier, right? And I know that the investment bankers that you refer to, the entrepreneurs who are working endlessly to get their businesses up and running, so many of us, and we conducted a national poll in the US that showed that nearly half of Americans feel time poor. Nearly half feel like they don't have enough time to do what they want to and set out to do. And the question, though, is answering my daydream are people who have a whole lot more time, are they in fact happier? And so what we did is we tested this. What's the relationship between the amount of discretionary time people have and their happiness? And we looked And a lot of data sets ran several studies. In one of our studies, we analyzed data from the American Time Use Survey that looks at for tens of thousands of working and non-working Americans, how they spent a regular day. And from that, we calculated how much time they spent on discretionary activities and related that to their life satisfaction, their happiness. And what we found was really interesting, this consistent pattern, which was an upside down U shape. So, like an arc or a rainbow. So, meaning that happiness goes down on both ends of the spectrum. So, yes, people with too little time who are time poor, and our, as you noted in our data, in that data set, we've it looked like those with less than approximately 2 hours of discretionary time in a day were unhappy or less happy. And that's because of higher feelings of stress. But what was interesting, I think, was that other side of the spectrum where we saw that there was such thing as having too much time. And those with more than approximately 5 hours of discretionary time in a day were also less happy. And what's sort of interesting about that is like it sort of, urges us not to quit in those like hectic days because you wouldn't necessarily be happier if you had all the days available or all the hours available to spend how you wanted. But digging into why is it that having more hours available in a day could be associated with less happiness? And it goes back to sort of what you noted, using the word purpose. So when we spend or have all the hours of our days and we spend them and sort of have nothing to show for them, that undermines our sense of purpose. We are driven to be somewhat productive. We are averse to being idle. And so, again, actually going back to what I said before, the answer for greater happiness isn't about being time rich. It's not about having all the hours available in excess of hours just to spend however you please day in and day out. It is really about how you invest the hours that you have available to make them feel worthwhile and to make them feel joyful and satisfying and fulfilling. And that can happen both within our work. It can also happen, with our personal lives. But it's not that more is better. It's
Hmm.
really about the way you invest, and it's not just the activities. It's also how you engage with those activities, your mindset while you're spending your time.
It almost sounds like the more time we have, the more holes it opens into really analyzing what you're doing with your time. Because if you have 3 hours available, you're just trying to relax and take it easy in the evening, maybe. But then 4 and 5 hours, it's like, well, I could be doing something else. I could pick up a hobby. I could start writing. I could start reading. And you realize then that you haven't been engaged for the rest of your time. Whereas on the flip side, some people make themselves too busy, go into that busy trap. And I definitely found that early in my career whereby I would have this pointless to-do list that was
Mhm.
never ending and that really didn't serve much purpose from a business perspective, from a financial perspective, from a career perspective. So I was putting myself under too much pressure and really squeezing my time. Whereas on the flip side, I've seen people then who don't necessarily have meaningful activities to work towards and therefore then lead a life of actually being unfulfilled and actually quite miserable at times. How have you seen that in terms of people not having activities to work on?
Yeah, and sort of 2 points to that is to the second point is what we found in the data was when people actually had a lot of discretionary time, if they engaged in activities that felt quote unquote worthwhile, that made them feel productive. So, like a hobby that's really engaging, or doing volunteer work that makes you feel like you're having an impact, then you actually didn't see that dip in happiness. So, again, it's about sort of what's worthwhile. So if you do find that you have a lot of hours available in your day, like, those that are fortunate enough to retire early, right?
Hmm.
The the way that you offset the sort of dissatisfaction and lacking sense of purpose is actually finding activities that, even if it's not paid work, that give you a sense of purpose, that make you feel like you're making progress, you're growing, learning, having a positive impact on those um, in your community or those around you. So it's not just that it's sort of discretionary time is a bad thing and more of it is a bad thing. It's really about how you spend the time, what activities you engage in. And to your first point about busyness, absolutely. Like having a to-do list, it's almost like and actually research shows that busyness has become somewhat of a status symbol because it's sort of signaling both to others and yourself that you're like important and needed and you have all these things that
Hmm.
you have to do and people that are relying on you. But that busyness, yes, it can signal that we're like getting stuff done, but it can be misleading because those things on your to-do list might not be that important. And we can distract ourselves from the work that is important to us or the activities that do matter to us because we're like so busy and we don't have time for it or
Yeah.
like I am important because I'm
Yeah.
doing a lot, but you're not necessarily doing things that are important to you. And
Yeah.
so a lot of what I talk about in my work and in the happier hour in my book is exactly that of like trying to figure out and providing exercises and empirics to help people identify what are those ways of spending your time that are in fact important. And when you invest in that, then at the end of the week, like you will likely be busy, but at least you feel fulfilled and motivated and satisfied, as opposed to what often happens is we look back on our week and we've been really busy, but none
Hmm.
of that stuff actually felt like it mattered. And there
Hmm.
you get that burnout and depleted and that negative, the unhappiness of being time poor.
Definitely. I can always be quite cynical in these points because I'm always thinking like it's the people that say that they're very busy are not busy. And then it's the ones then that are like, the busy entrepreneurs or people who are actually focused are too busy to say that they're actually busy because they're all actually working. So I always kind of notice that. And the more that I've kind of become like, like a individual, like, business owner or whatever, I've realized this myself that, okay, if you actually truly are busy, you're not talking about it, you're not sitting at a coffee machine, all that kind of good stuff. So when you started focusing on how we like spend our time and how we focus in on that, especially in a work context. So you link a lot of this with happiness, and I completely am on the exact same path. But for a lot of people, they're quite, they don't have much more options versus their 9 to 5 at the moment. They don't really have much options to go off and do what they really, really want. How do you kind of look at optimizing the time spent when you're working? Like, how can you actively be more engaged in what you do?
Yeah. And I want to point out that like my interest and sort of goal is happiness, it's satisfaction. And what I mean by happiness is feeling positive emotion in our day and greater satisfaction about our life. So there's both that emotional as well as a valuative component. And it's not at odds with productivity. In fact, um, research shows that when we feel better, when we feel happier, it makes us more motivated. It makes us more engaged. Like employees who are happier are more engaged. They're better performers. They're better colleagues. They're less likely to burn out. They're less likely to not show up for work, and they're less likely to leave the company. So there's like that business justification, but I care more about the personal justification. It's like when you prioritize your emotional well-being, it allows you to show up better both in the work you do and for those around you, and it's sustainable because you're not going to get burnt out and you're not going to sort of throw in the towel at some point because you're just sort of over it, it's not satisfying. So um and it's really important to um, find happiness within the work that we do and within their work hours, because if you look the average person, the majority of their waking hours are spent working. And if there's just sort of this mindset of like, I'm going to get through those hours in order to enjoy my life outside of it. That's not sustainable because we can't actually compartmentalize. How you feel, your job satisfaction is a significant predictor of your life satisfaction. And there's also the hours of our days sum up to the years of our life, and we don't want to wait through such a huge portion of our life for something better. We don't want to look back on our weeks or on our life overall with regret. So, and there are absolutely ways to make our work hours feel satisfying and fulfilling without even leaving a job. You can find greater happiness in the job that you have. In my course, so I teach MBAs and executive MBAs, the the sort of science of happiness, and it's really the course that's the basis of Happier Hour. My book is research shows that when you do time tracking, that for most people, actually, their work hours are among their least happy. And the hours that they spend that are the most tend to involve social connection. That insight in itself highlights how you can make work happier, is that you pull in social connection, you pull in friendship into your work hours. There's a funny question in Gallup data that asks, do you have a best friend at work? And it's a funny question because it sounds like something my fourth grader would ask, like, do you have a best friend? But the answer to that is really important. So pre-pandemic, 2 out of 10 Americans said that they had a best friend at work, only 2 out of 10. But those who did were 3 times more engaged in their work. They were better performers. They were less likely to leave the company. Friendship, social connection, like friendship, like the real, like not just sort of like, you know,
Getting through
colleagues that you spend
it.
time with. It's like friendship. Like you feel
Mhm.
known and you know the person and you care about the person, they care about you. Um, that is like, it's so important to develop in the workplace so that then you get excited about work. So it's sort of bundling. So a very effective strategy to make some of our less happy hours more happy is to bundle that activity, the time you spend doing something you don't want to do, with something that you do enjoy doing. So then all of a sudden that time feels more enjoyable. Katie Milkman and her colleagues talk about this as a way to motivate people to do things they don't want to do. I talk about it as a way to make that time feel more fulfilling. So bundling work hours with social connection, all of a sudden that time feels more worthwhile. Another really important thing to do is understand the underlying why you do the work that you're doing. What is like the impact that you're having? What's the meaning of your work? And not like the job description, but really what drives you in the work that you do. And in Happier Hour, I talk about the 5 whys exercise. And this is an exercise to help folks identify their purpose in their work. What is it that really motivates you intrinsically, genuinely to do what you do? And so the 5 whys is because you're asking and answering 5 layers of why. So why do you do the work that you do? Generally, that first answer is like the job description. So, like for me, I am a business school professor, so I do research and I teach. Well, why do I do that? And well, it's about creating knowledge and disseminating knowledge. But why that? Why is that important to me? Well, I want to make people smart. But why do I want to make people smart? I want to make them smart about their happiness so they can make decisions about what makes them happy. Well, why? And then with answering that 5th layer of why, I clarify like what is my purpose in my work? I want to create knowledge about what makes people happy and disseminate knowledge about what makes people happy. And knowing that makes the unfun parts of my job all of a sudden more less onerous because I know the reason, right? So if I'm uh, email, I hate email. I hate my inbox. I truly have a very unhappy relationship with it. But when I'm like, okay, responding to an email to a research collaborator, I'm like, oh, this is about creating knowledge about what makes people happy, shifting it away from responding to email and putting it into my purpose. It's like, oh, I'm doing this for something I care about. And not only by knowing your purpose, does it make the unfun parts of your job feel more fun because you realize that there's a point to it, makes it feel more worthwhile. It makes some of your job like so truly joyful. Like when you have a win that's in line with what really drives you, it is so rewarding, so satisfying. Also, it's very clarifying of what you take on, what you say yes to and what you say no to, like what projects you take on, because you're like, oh, is it in line with my purpose? Like if I'm asked to give a talk, is it about disseminating knowledge about what makes people happy? If so, then yes, it's worth my time. That's like in line with what I care about and it feels worthwhile. If it's not, it's a committee that has nothing to do with the happiness anywhere, then I say no, because there
Mhm.
are only so many hours of the day. And I just by taking things on and being busy, to what we were talking about before, doesn't mean that I'm actually being productive. What I want to do is be productive and invest the time that I have in things that are in line with what I'm working towards with
Mhm.
my purpose. So social
That's a
connection,
very
knowing the
that's a very
why.
uncomfortable truth as well for people sometimes, isn't it? Because they wouldn't be that comfortable with going that deep with the why they're doing it. Maybe they were given a plan, they were given a job to do, but they don't understand why they're doing it. And I've often even felt that as well when I was younger. Like my background was working in trading. Like if I was to go to the deeper layers of why I'm trading, why I get into it, I'd probably go back to my own social status of why I wanted to be and what my perception of what other people want, my perception of other people, what I want them to think of me, and things like this. And that's probably why I went down that kind of route. Whereas when you're looking at things that are maybe for other people, or you're trying to uplift someone or bring people to another stage or help people or even help people make more money, then you have a bit more of a real purpose, I think. And it could be quite uncomfortable for people. I think you've seen that as well with your research when you ask those hard, difficult questions. People maybe not respond as easily as you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, it can be scary because you can, like, the scariness comes from, like, oh, if I ask myself why, 5 layers of why, you might uncover that you actually don't have real sort of drive or meaning in the work that you're doing. But I think that it's worthwhile because it
It's necessary.
you many can be surprised that there actually is something that's driving them to do that work. And I mean, even within the finance sector, in the book, I interviewed someone who's a wealth manager and about his purpose. And he was very clear. Like, first it's about, like, well, making money and making money from my clients. Like, well, why is that important? And then he got down to answering for himself, like, what he wants to do is give people a sense of security. And that's something. And it's like realizing that, of that assurance of sort of not having money is actually a great source of stress for many people. Not, and the research shows having more and more money isn't a source of happiness, but not having money, having stress around being able to meet your needs is a great source of unhappiness. And to the extent that you're like, oh, I'm helping individuals against that fear and stress, like, so all to say, even if at the face of it, your job doesn't seem like seem super altruistic or meaningful, like, there are absolutely features of your job of understanding why you do the work that you're doing. Like another example, um, one of my friends is the sort of head of people, but it's basically like HR at a marketing, a sort of tech marketing firm. On the face of it, it's like marketing. It's like helping people sell things to other people. Like, what's the purpose there? But in actually recognizing that in one case, it is helping a small business owner develop marketing to make cakes. But cakes, it's like, whatever, help someone celebrate their birthday. But what are like that cake that if you aren't doing your job, that like then that entrepreneur isn't able to create this business that brings sort of yummy joy into people's days. So you can like go into and find the why. Again, that at the face of it might, tech marketing isn't the most purposeful, but when you realize that you're helping like a small business owner create a business that brings joy into people's days, like that's cool. Um,
Definitely.
yeah,
What's interesting there as well is that it may not even be front facing. It could be internal. It could be his family is taken care of. It could be, a sick elderly parent or grandparent that he's able to take care of now because he's had this cake business. So that's the
yeah,
kind of benefit you see going both ways. You mentioned about money as well, and that was one thing I wanted to ask. Well, there's two sides. That there was. Let's focus first on the difficult and the challenges of doing something that's difficult. So, a lot of people will move away from their 9 to 5 to build, let's say, a business. Let's say that cake developer, and there's struggle in that, and there's really struggle in that. And people sometimes seek that discomfort for a better life. So maybe that entrepreneur can produce more money for his family down the line, but goes through a lot of difficulty in the beginning. Do you think that's a path to happiness, is to take the road less traveled, seek discomfort versus the comfortable, stable salary in the short term?
um, I think it is dependent on what drives that purpose or that person. Um, if it is just so, there's this quote by Henry Ford, the automaker. Businesses must be run at a profit, or else you can't sustain the business. But if it's run solely for profit, then the business shouldn't exist.
Hmm.
So, and that is me paraphrasing it, which is that you need money to live. Businesses need to make money to be able to continue the business. But if the sole reason of the business is to make money, or the sole motivator for the person is to make money, then that is not a secret to happiness and fulfillment. You need the money in order to, meet your basic needs so that you can do what you need to do, and the business needs the the revenue in order to be able to continue to be a business. But understanding the purpose, why are why is your business a business? Like, what are you doing? What's the purpose, the goal, the impact of the business? And for us as individuals, what are we setting out to do? What impact do we want to have? What is our why? And also, what is really helpful, particularly as I think this identifying your own purpose and what drives you, what is your intrinsic motivator, is so helpful for folks who are sort of starting out on their careers and throughout their careers. Because what it does is it clarifies what your metric of success is. It clarifies what you're directed to. So often, like this idea of like success, it's so nebulous. There's so many dimensions, and you get sort of swept up in what others around you view as important. And like money is this like easy thing because it's quantifiable, and you can be like, oh, that's success. But there's always going to be someone who makes more. So through social comparison, that's not a secret to happiness, because we tend to focus on those who are better off than us and those who are worse off than us. So, and as I was saying before, money isn't that sort of satisfying thing. It's the thing that can fuel and sort of support what your efforts are. Um, but even if it's like other dimensions of like what is success, by answering your whys, by understanding what drives you, that is so helpful, because it's not like, oh, how is that person doing? How am I doing relative to them? Or how is that person doing? It's like, how am I doing relative to what I'm setting out to do? And if there's a disconnect, that's what motivates you. You're like, oh, wait, I'm working towards this. I'm going to work, like, as opposed to the motivator, the social comparison of like having, oh, they're doing better, I need to work hard to like be as good as them. It's sort of like, it's never going to be, because there's always going to be someone better. But
Leading.
also it's not satisfying at all, like when you get there. And then like when you know your why, it's like much more focused. So it's like my MBAs, they're like, oh, everyone's applying for consulting, and I don't know what I want to do, is I'm going to apply to consulting. And it's like, well, what's driving you? And then that actually is like, oh, maybe it's still within consulting, but maybe it's like a particular form, because they know where they're trying to get to.
hmm I always think about that because it's kind of like if you don't have your own goal, you're going to be like set a goal or you're going to follow someone else's goal if you don't have that strategic positioning. And I don't know whose quote it was, but it's like the biggest, kind of challenge you have or the difficulty you have is the person you could be if you actually did what you said you were going to do. I think it's very interesting because like we can always look at our potential ourselves. You're obviously very intelligent. You're a great writer. You're great. You can great to disseminate knowledge and break it into other people. So it would be in your best interest to go and pursue that to your level. And same with me. I enjoy speaking with people. I enjoy actually building. I enjoy going from 0 to 1. So it's kind of like I want to do those things. And of course, a lot of my mates are hugely successful entrepreneurs. Like some guys that are making 50, 60,000 a month, but it's not about looking at that. It's kind of looking at where I could potentially get to. And I felt like myself, I became much more comfortable, not necessarily comfortable in terms of slowing down, but comfortable with my own progression by understanding my own metrics of success. But I think
Yeah,
it could be a maturity thing as well, because in my early 20s, it was, I want to be seen to be successful. Whereas now it's, I want to just actually be successful on my own metrics. So it
yeah.
comes kind of full circle.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so great that you gain clarity as to what it is that your sort of what your goals are, your personal goals are, because it's a very defeatist approach when you are measuring your success by looking at those around you on lots of things. So, like, even if it wasn't money, you're like, oh, they're successful because they have lots of money and I have less. They're successful because they have a lot of like power, or like they're like super famous, or like there's all these different, they're awesome because they're like so super attractive. Like there's so many dimensions that someone is always going to be better. And like,
Mhm.
but when you pull in your when you're clear about what your goals are and you claim them, then you're not looking to other people as to like to assess how you're doing. You're just looking at like how you're doing relative to your goals.
Mhm.
And it's much more satisfying. I mean, the reason that actually money and more money doesn't lead to as much happiness as people think, and this is empirically backed, is like, there's two things. One is social comparison. So that is our tendency to assess how we're doing. Remember, I said what happiness is, this how we feel, but also how we evaluate our lives. Um, Through social comparison, oftentimes we're evaluating our lives compared to other people, as opposed to how we're sort of feeling, and do we have what we need, and are we satisfied in what we have. And so through social comparison, uh, money, because also as you get more money, you then live in neighborhoods where things are nicer. And so your like reference point continues to change. And that is not a source of happiness, right? So if you have your own, you're so clear on your metric of success, then it's really not only is it, are you sort of managing against the unhappiness from like comparing yourself to your mates, as you said, your friends, on like whatever dimension that they're sort of working on, but you can also feel really happy when when you're doing what you set out to do. It's like you're not worried about it, and it's really joyful.
Mhm. And that's why, like, enjoying the process is often way better than the destination, but you can only do that if you know what you're trying to strive for. And
Mhm.
one of my best mates, actually, a very interesting story. He is like, smart guy. He's actually working in marketing. He's trying to become a DJ, like, proper international DJ, really musically talented, but is like the first person in his family to do it, first of his friends, and he's leaving a good job, and he's like really scared to leave his job. And I was just thinking, like, I was speaking to him on Friday night, it was super late, and I was like, this is like such a beautiful moment, because you're going to look back in like a year or two, and this is the part you should enjoy. Like, you should enjoy it while you're scared and broke and trying to figure it out, versus when you do start getting good gigs and getting signed to a label and an agency, and then them started booking you, and he was talking about 12 months from now he should have this type of label and all things like this. And I was like, that's not the necessarily enjoyable part, although it might seem be, but this is the enjoyable part. Um,
Yeah.
and it's awesome though, because I think it's like, if you extrapolate your goals over 10 to 15 to 20 years, it's kind of like anything is like possible, like literally anything. But it's like, we think that in the short term we can't achieve these things, or we think that waking up tomorrow morning and doing 200 words, or 200 or 20 pages of your book means nothing. But now, you're on this path of doing all these podcasts and doing lots of speeches and engagements, and now everyone sees the outcome and the output of your labor.
Yeah, to your point, the process is much more fun when you know why, sort of like where you're heading, and you can savor it more. And also, like the thing I didn't say, that was like there's two underlying like reasons that um, money doesn't sort of lead to as much happiness as we think, and more. So one is social comparison. The other is hedonic adaptation. So, this is our tendency to get used to things over time. That is, when we do the same thing again and again, when we're with the same person again and again, when we're in the same circumstances for a long time, it stops having the same emotional impact. That is, we hedonically adapt. That is, like, we get used to things over time such that we don't notice them and it doesn't affect us so much. So, it's good that we're adaptive in the face of negative circumstances or negative experiences, because it makes us sort of tolerant and resilient. But it's bad because as we have these like really wonderful circumstances, then we also get used to them and stop noticing. So to your friend, he's sort of embarking on this journey. Like, first of all, good for him. Like, the courage it takes is so fantastic, and that conviction, like, even if there are sort of failures along the way, which there absolutely will be, it's not really a failure, because he's giving it a shot. He's going for what he cares about. But also, when slash if he does become successful and then starts booking these things, and then he's traveling around the world and doing this, like, at some point he's going to adapt to that, and then he's going to like, I'm tired of traveling, like, he'll get used to it, and such
Yeah.
that it doesn't have that same emotional impact. And so sort of managing against hedonic adaptation is actually really important too, because so that you continue to enjoy the sort of the simple pleasures that are right there in like what you're doing. Um, there's actually research by Jordi Quadbach and colleagues where they show that actually people who have a whole lot of money and therefore have access to these like incredible experiences savor less because of the excess. Like it's actually recognizing that the things are limited that makes us savor and appreciate it more. And so, I talk about this with respect to time. That is, we were looking at what are the experiences that produce the greatest happiness or contribute to our happiness most? Is it the extraordinary experiences or is it ordinary experiences? So extraordinary experiences like, that incredible vacation, that fantastic meal, that going to the concert, versus more ordinary experiences like, enjoying a simple moment with your partner or taking a dog for a walk or noticing the sun rising. And what we found is in among younger people, they experience greater happiness from extraordinary experiences than ordinary experiences. Among older people, they experience as much happiness from ordinary experiences as extraordinary. Now, you might be sort of like, why does this matter? It matters because there's so much potential happiness that's right there in our lives that often we overlook them because we're so used to them. But it's not age that actually influences the happiness from ordinary experiences, it's recognizing that time is limited. So as people get older, they tend to realize that their time in life is finite, and recognizing that time is limited and makes us think that it's precious. And then even those simple things become like extraordinary almost because that they're so limited. The value of them increases. But so what we saw, actually, I would say what we saw in the pandemic, when all of us were led to reckon with the fact that life is finite, and our years are not for sure to be endless and long or extensive. What you saw is that everyone started to savor more. And in our experiments, when we made young people recognize their time is limited, then they started to savor more. So, all to say, it's not that I want to sort of dissuade people away from these extraordinary experiences that are so extraordinary and wonderful and fun and exciting, but also I think it's so helpful to recognize that there's a lot of awesome, wonderful, joyful experiences that are available to us to make us happy that we tend to overlook because of hedonic adaptation, or we think that they are endless and that they will always be available to us, but in
Mhm.
fact they're not.
Yeah, it's so interesting to analyze because I would myself think, oh, I don't like adapt to these scenarios. Like, oh no, like, I'm so very like humble and I appreciate things. But my 30th floor apartment in Singapore, I just come in and just look at these days and just walk past. But when I first came here, I loved it and I still love it. I look over the city in the evenings and I love it. But I don't look at the balcony the same way I looked at the balcony when I first got the lease for the
Right.
year, you know?
Totally.
But in contrast, because I was reading, your work months and months ago, and when you said about the finite time, I always think about that in terms of my dog. So my dog is only 2, but I know he's not going to live forever, and I know that probability from perspective, I will probably live longer. So I always just think of that, and myself and my partner, like always like value it more. And like she says, he's going to live forever, and I still kind of think he does as well. But you know, I kind of think about it in that perspective that a dog only lives for like maybe 10 years at a maximum. So even now that he's super healthy and super like, up for running around and all this, we do like savor those moments more. Um, and I bet you see a lot of those kind of examples too with like either like pets or like with family, especially as you get older into different kind of brackets of your age.
Yeah, and friendships. So in one of the exercises that I have my students do is count their times left. So pick something that you enjoy doing, count how many times you've done it in your life thus far, and then calculate, estimate, count how many times will you have left to do it in your life, accounting for the fact that circumstances will change in your life. Like if it involves someone else, like your dog, that, you know, his life is only so long. And so, and then once you see, and then you take the percentage, how many of your total times in your life of doing this do you have left? And more often than not, it's much less than you think. So one of my students actually did this with his dog, and he counted how many times, how many walks will he have with his dog left. And he calculated, like between like work travel, which is away, and then like his dog, will probably live another 8 years. Um, that motivated him. He's like, okay, on Saturdays, instead of thinking of it as a chore of like taking the dog out, he like turned it into this thing of like taking the dog to the beach, because this is like realizing that he only had like whatever 45% left. And I'm so happy that he did that, because that same student took my course, another course that I was teaching 6 months later, and he was super conscientious, and it was their final presentation and he wasn't there, and I was like, what is the deal? And he came in halfway and he was all sort of disheveled, and he's like, I'm so sorry I'm late, I just had to put my dog down. And he hadn't known, when he was calculating, that his dog actually had a cancer that was going to make
Oh
it,
my
so he
gosh.
was expecting 5 years left, but it ended up being whatever, 5 months. But he was so grateful for having counted and like savored, because even though it was much less than he even expected, by recognizing that it was limited overall, he had spent those months like on those Saturday walks were like this joyful thing that he hadn't taken for granted. And so, just to say, we don't know how long we have left in things. Um, but recognizing that the times are finite makes us make the most of them. It makes us pay attention. It makes us make the time for them, sort of protect the time for it. But also, like, when, make the time to go, take your dog out and enjoy the beautiful, Singapore like landscape. But also, when you're doing it by recognizing that the time is limited, it makes you soak it up and savor it. One of another student actually calculated, sitting on the couch watching sports with his buddy, his best friend, and he calculated like in their youth, like it was like every day in middle school they would come home and like sit on the couch and watch sports, and then like when they went off to college, it was for all of summer break and like Christmas break. And then he was calculating how many times will he have left to sit on the couch and watch sports with his buddy, and recognizing that now they live in different cities, they have work that makes it so like they can't go and visit each other, and also now they have partners. So, and his friend has a little kid, and so even when they go to visit each other, the time of just sitting on the couch and watching sports is like this negotiated thing. And so something that was so much of fabric, and it seems so simple, as like sitting with your buddy watching sports on the couch, that recognizing how limited it actually is going forward, then like from that exercise of counting times left, he then went out and like he called his friend, he's like, dude, we need a guys trip, like we need to make this time. So it's not just old people that can have the impact of recognizing our time is limited. What it does for all of us is recognizing that phases of our life will change, circumstances will change, and these things that bring us great joy aren't inevitable and are not forever. And so making sure that when we do spend the time with them, and it doesn't need to be a whole lot of time, again, going back to our very initial conversation, it's about richness of that time. It's about the quality of the time, not being distracted during it, savoring it, soaking it up. It doesn't need to be a whole lot of time for it to have a really big effect on your happiness.
Yeah, you really realize how much time is wasted on things that we deem important, but then are actually completely meaningless. Like, kind of being, not being able to draw a distinction between activities that are, busy or important, and then things that are actually important. So whether it's seeing a friend for an hour in the evening, or meeting up with family, or giving your parents a call, or bundling activities. They're the kind of activities that actually generate more actually happiness versus being super stressed on your laptop, hunched over, just very like annoyed in those instances whereby you could have just alleviated a lot of the pressure. And I guess that's where bundling comes into it really well, whether it's doing activities you don't enjoy or trying to improve fixed areas of your life like commuting that you write about that you
Yeah.
can't necessarily change.
Yeah, it's about making that time worthwhile. So, like commuting, housework, these are times and work hours that people associate as the least happy. But if you bundle it with something that does bring you joy, then that time all of a sudden feels more worthwhile. So, like if you're commuting by car, listen to a podcast, listen to audiobooks, and then all of a sudden, instead of scrolling, or if you commute by subway or train, instead of scrolling mindlessly through your social media, um, like read a book, listen to a book, and then you learn and you're inspired and you feel empathic, all of those sort of good things. When people say, I have people say, complete the sentence, I don't have time to, reading for pleasure is a very common response. But you could actually read for pleasure if you pull out time away from some of these other wastes of time. I think it's helpful, and like also this difference between what's important versus what seems urgent. And there are some activities that are important and urgent. There are some activities that are urgent, but not necessarily important. And unfortunately, and then there's important, but not necessarily urgent, and then neither. But the urgent, but not important, those are the ones we have to be careful about, because when an activity seems urgent, that's where we'd spend our time. That's what gets our attention, irrespective of the importance of it. And that's where you get into the trap that you were talking about before of that busyness. It's like we have all these things that we have to do because they seem really urgent. And it's like responding to that person, taking that meeting, going to that work dinner, because it seems urgent. But the question is it important? And using the purpose filter that I talked about, and there's so much that we haven't talked about that I talked about in Happy Hour, of recognizing, spending our time on what's important, having that be the drive, and is sort of like the answer for how do we invest our hours for greater happiness. And by spending on what's important, it sort of strips away a lot of wasted time that we tend to do. I think it's actually, there's an analogy that I think is super helpful for this, about prioritization. And it's really, and I continue to touch back on it when in my own time spending decisions. And it's nicely depicted in a short film that I share in the first day of my class. And in the film, a professor walks into his classroom, and on the front desk, he puts a large clear jar. And then from a bag next to it, he pulls out golf balls and he pours the golf balls into the large jar such that they reach the very top. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And they nod their head because it looks full, but nope. And then from the bag, he pulls out pebbles and he pours the pebbles into the jar, and the pebbles fill the spaces between the golf balls up to the top. And he asks again, is the jar full? And the students nod because it looks full, but nope. So he pulls out sand and he pours the sand into the jar, and the sand fills all those spaces between the pebbles and between the golf balls up to the top. Is the jar full? By this point, the students are like laughing and like, yes, the jar is full. But there's one more step. He pulls out 2 bottles of beer. He opens one, pours it into the jar. He opens the other, and he goes and sort of perches himself at the front of the desk and takes a sip. And he explains, this jar represents the time of your life. Those golf balls are those things that really matter to you. Your relationships with your family, your friendships, the work that you do that is in line with your passion. The pebbles are the other things in your life that matter, like your job, your house. The sand, though, is everything else. The sand is all of that stuff that fills your time without you even thinking about, all that stuff that seems urgent but isn't important, like scrolling social media, your email inbox, the requests that come in that are never ending, like all that stuff that fills your time. And what's really important to notice is that had he put the sand into the jar first, all of the golf balls would not have fit. That's to say, if we let our time get filled, it absolutely will get filled, but not necessarily with the stuff that matters. So, what's so important is to identify your golf balls, know what those golf balls are. What are those things that really do matter to you? Put them into your schedule first. Make the time for them, protect the time for them, be paying attention when you're spending that time. Because then at the end of the week, yes, we will all be busy, but if you have invested in those golf balls, then you can look back with that satisfaction and fulfillment versus what so often is like that sand, the sand that's just there and you're so busy, but none of it feels worthwhile. And then one of the students was like, well, professor, what's the deal with the beer? It's like, glad you asked. The beer goes to show that no matter how busy you are, no matter how full your time and your schedule, you always have time for a drink with a friend. And so that's something else, right? Those friendships, that social connection is absolutely so important, and that we have to make time for. Those simple joys are sort of there's there's space for it in the craziness of our days.
That's an amazing story. I actually love that. There's so much depth to that element because I think that's exactly what people are forgetting when they get into the work life. They're like, "Oh, my job is so busy. I can't do anything. I can't see my friends, and now I'm in a relationship and I can't do anything else, and I've got out of shape and everything." There's so much other excuses for what's after happening, but it's kind of like your actions are misaligned with what you should be doing and what your purpose is and what you could potentially be doing with your life. And now, as a result, this is your new plan. And this is what's after happening. In terms of the relationship aspect, which is huge as well. How much you see that happening, like people kind of giving up that opportunity of to meet new friends or do new opportunities, especially as they get older. Because of course I'm 26 at the moment, but I instantly see my friend group shrinking. However, what I do find though is from building a podcast, and I'm very public with everything I do, from my business to my career, I have built new friends who are internet friends who I do see in person from time to time. But I have like a kind of like a flock of people that I've met that are all the same people. Like we're all extensions of each other. That's what I have found. But that's a unique scenario because I
Right.
literally record podcasts every day. So it's a bit of a different scenario.
Yeah. Social connection and that sense of genuine connection. And it can happen. It doesn't have to happen, like in the same space or like sharing a childhood together. It's like, but feeling that sense of being known, of knowing and being cared about and caring, that friendship, right, of understanding each other's emotional experience is so important. And it comes in different ways and also shifts over the course of life. There's this, it's sort of interesting when you look at friendships and like what they sort of constitute and how it changes over life. So like 2-year olds, they have their like best friend, but that's like who they enjoy playing with most. Then you get into adolescence and it's a lot about self-disclosure of like who understands me, who do I feel comfortable sharing my experience with. And then as you get into actually and it's not a lot of friends. Like it's always like those really good friends. It's like a handful. It's actually in one's 20s, you see, in early 30s, you see a biggest group because oftentimes what happens is people's partners then you like almost like get the friends of your partner too and then you see it, but the role of friendship changes. And then even like in like old like much older people, it's about like social support. So it's like, do you show up and like do favors for each other? All to say that the number and sort of role of friends shifts over the course of life based off of what you're doing and your needs and sort of changing circumstances. But regardless of the number and the sort of how it shows up, having a sense of social connection is so, so important, and it is absolutely worth investing in. Um, Not only like with your partner, but also friendships outside of just that partner.
Yeah, it's kind of like having those experiences with new people, or else just like novel experiences with existing friends, doing something new builds that deeper connection. Cassie, I'd like to say a massive thank you. This was a very insightful session, very unique. I love these type of conversations because you've done so much research, and it's just touching the tip of the iceberg. But we'll do more sessions in the future. If I ever make it to the States, we can record in person too. But I'd like to say a massive thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was very fun, very worthwhile, and
My
joyful, and all
pleasure.
that good stuff. So thank you.
My pleasure. So at 2 a.m. we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much.